Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about sci-fi versus fantasy settings. Specifically in a new IP, this comes from a question from Hungry Hungry Hobo 196 who asked, "Hey Tim, if you had your choice to make a new CRPG, would you rather do a high fantasy or sci-fi? How do you feel about sci-fi with fantasy elements such as magic? And how hard is it to make a game that has guns or lasers and make a sword feel viable?" Those are good questions. And once again, I found myself going, haven't I already talked about that? And I looked and I haven't talked about it in one of my videos. But this is a perfect example of the kind of discussions I've had with many, many, many other game developers. We talk about things like this all the time. And what's fun about talking with your fellow game developers is you're not trying to convince someone like a publisher or someone above you to make a game. This could be like a lunchtime thing where you're just sitting around talking and you're like, yeah, you know what I prefer between these two, and here's why. And then there's a spirited discussion of the topic. And no one's necessarily trying to convince anyone. You're just trying to go, well, here's what I think, blah, blah, blah. I love discussions like that because it helps me kind of hash out my own feelings on the topic. So anyway, Hungry Hobo, those are good. Oh, Hungry Hobo. Those are good questions. Let me do them in reverse because I think talking about it a little more specifically and then I build up to what my choice would be kind of makes more sense. So let's start with, how would you make swords feel good when you already have guns? Now, at this point, I want to say I've already done that several times. The Outer Worlds had both. Arcanum had both. Pillars of Eternity had both. However, only the first one was sci-fi. Arcanum was, kind of classified as a fantasy game with an Industrial Revolution, which I'll get to. And Pillars was seen as fantasy. It just had guns. So, if you want to make melee viable with guns, one of the obvious things is that guns require ammo and melee does not. So ammo means a whole bunch of things right there. You have to buy it or find it. You only have a limited number of shots before you have to reload, and some things may shoot slowly and reload their ammo exceptionally slowly. So you have to account for that. There's also ranged penalties. The farther away you're shooting at something, the less chance you have to hit. So all of those things tend to make try to balance ranged against melee. But what's tough about that is having a non-zero chance to hit someone far away is always higher than the 0% chance you have to hit them with a melee weapon, because you can't use melee at range. So what I did on the Outer Worlds was I just said, okay, you can't miss with a melee weapon. You cannot miss. If the target is within the range of your weapon and the target's within your arc of attack, you always hit. So instead of your skill determining whether you hit or miss on melee weapons, your skill determined damage. The higher skilled you were, the more damage you did. And that was reflected as you're better at using this weapon, you're better at finding their weak spots, you know how to swing, you know where to swing, you know when to swing. So all of that was wrapped up in the skill, which was reflected in your higher damage. That was my attempt to make melee and ranged a little more balanced. And when you threw in the fact that ammo cost money and you had to reload the weapon, it kind of helped balance out that delta. The second question is my feeling on science fiction games that have fantasy elements. And obviously I like that, because the question was, do you like it? Yes, I do. What are my feelings towards it? And in which case, I'll talk about Arcanum. Arcanum was a fantasy game that was hitting an Industrial Revolution. So while we sold it as a fantasy game that was starting to get, a technological aspect, you could view it as a technological game with magic, because they had reached a point in that world where magic wasn't reigning supreme, where tech was starting to rise. In fact, you could potentially make a sequel in the Arcanum setting in the future. And you could make it so that tech was way more powerful than magic. Magic had diminished a lot. So a future sequel of Arcanum could be a sci-fi game with a little bit of fantasy elements in it. It's an interesting idea for a sequel. I don't know if it's in my book. I should add it to my book. Anyway, just remember, though, that when you ask me my question on a sci-fi with fantasy elements, is keep in mind that I always like to make my setting first. So if I know it's a sci-fi game, but I want a little bit of fantasy elements in it, then my story and the subsequent mechanics I make had better back that up. If you end up making a game and it's all about magic, but magic is a tiny part of the setting you created, you're kind of doing yourself an injustice. Now, if what you want to do is explore why there even is magic and why it's going away or why it's so weak, that could be fun, especially in a world where it's mostly sci-fi and no one even believes in magic. You could do that. But again, your story and your mechanics need to support something like that. So that's my big feeling on that, is if you're going to make a sci-fi game with fantasy elements, that's your setting. Now figure out a good story and a good set of mechanics to support that. So that brings me to, now that I've given all that context, that brings me to my choice. So if someone gave me a big bag of money, said you got to make a new CRPG, and you have to, I'm going to make you do it, what would I choose as the setting? In that case, my choice, I think by now, well, maybe it's not clear, fantasy. And here's why. Both fantasy and sci-fi have a huge variety in the kind of settings you can do. And once you have that big variety in setting, that means you can have a lot of different stories you can tell, a lot of different kind of NPCs you can have, good and bad, a lot of different wildly different creatures you can have. So once we agree that they both have a lot of variety, let me say that the reason I'd always go with fantasy over sci-fi, if forced to choose, was because fantasy comes with a lot more connotation. And I know that I use that word a lot. Connotation means that when a word or a concept invokes feelings in the listener, or even ideas, that are beyond the primary definition of the word. Let me give you some examples. No matter what my fantasy game is, if you hear it has zombies, or vampires, or dragons, you already have connotation of what that means. Now, I can still do cool things with them. I could have the zombies, when people die and come back, they still have all their memories, and maybe they even have their feelings, but they're trapped in this rotting shell that's driven by insatiable hunger for brains. And you could do a whole story about that. I could do a cool story on vampires. I mean, not every vampire game is the same. You could talk about vampire origin and how different vampires deal with getting the food source they need, which is blood. And, that there have been games and shows to compare animal blood with human blood and all that. Dragons, are they mindless? Are they intelligent? Can they talk? Can they do spells? Can they go to other planes? I mean, it's just, there's so many things you can do with it. But in all those, the base zombie, the base vampire, the base dragon is something that the player will go into this fantasy game already having a good connotation about. So even magic works wildly differently in all the fantasy games. But everybody kind of knows what magic is. It's this thing you can do, this ability you get, and you can make effects happen. I did a whole video on magic costing the caster dearly, and I'll link it below, which is a way you can make magic feel really different. And a lot of people in the comments said, oh, there's already a game out there that does that. Great. I'm just saying, most of them don't. Most of them treat magic as they would, oh, I'm going to make Fireball now. Boom, Fireball made. Most of them are like that. So there's still a wide variety of things you can do. And what I'm hoping I'm making clear there is even though there's a lot of connotation in fantasy settings, there are still a lot of notions that you can leverage to make that fantasy game unique and your own thing. So that brings us to sci-fi. And you're probably thinking, well, can I do that with sci-fi? My problem with sci-fi is every time you introduce something, whether it's your faster than light drive or aliens, or almost anything about your setting, your technology, you have to explain so much to the player to have them go, oh, okay, I get what kind of sci-fi this setting is. In some sense, it's almost like the variety is so broad and so disconnected from each other that the connotation isn't always clear. For example, most of you probably know what a Klingon is or a Wookiee, but just because you know Star Trek and Star Wars, and they're really popular science fiction IPs. But how many of you know what a Scrambler is, or an Elcor, or a Chila? And how many of you are now going to look those up and then going, oh yeah, I know what they were? No, if you have to look them up, it's just, this isn't me going, haha, look what you don't know about sci-fi. It's, sci-fi is so broad that I can say zombie, vampire, dragon, and you're all like, mm-hmm. But at the moment I said Chila, a lot of you were like, Chila? What's a Chila? And they were very important to that novel. The novel was all about them. I gave you a hint. But my point is, they need to be explained at some point to the audience, and often explained in detail. Something you don't have to do in a fantasy game. Because sci-fi, you don't have those notions built in that you can already leverage. You have to construct them and then leverage them. Now, this can be really good because sci-fi lets you make a complete tabula rasa, blank slate settings. But it can exhaust your audience if you don't do it well. You need really, really good writers. You need really, really good system mechanic designers. And you need to make sure that everything unfolds slowly enough that people can grasp it, but not so fast or not so slow that it's glacial and they're like, this is a boring game. So it can be done, but you have to be a lot more careful in sci-fi. Of course, one way around that is to do something I did, which is you go near future sci-fi, like Fallout. So there's still a lot of base things they get. Like I know what a bomb is, a nuclear bomb is, and radiation and, things like that. But we still had to explain an awful lot. We had to explain super mutants and exactly what they were, and ghouls and FEV. But these were all put into a setting that a lot of people already had good notions about, so we could build on it. But once you get past near future sci-fi, all bets are off, because there can be wildly different futures, as evidenced by all the different far future books that are out there. So, don't misunderstand me. Both fantasy and sci-fi are good settings, and I've made games in both of them. But if forced to choose, I do have a preference, and that's fantasy. By the way, I'm going to link my video on how to make a good setting. So if this video gave you any ideas and you want to make a good setting, I'll link below on how I think you should go about doing that. So I hope that answered your question. Hungry Hobo 196.